biggest confrontations don't begin with missiles. They begin with lines on a map. In this video, we'll explain what the Philippines actually did, why China reacted so forcefully, what international law really says, and why this dispute could influence the future balance of power in one of the world's most strategically important waterways. On paper, what the Philippines did looked surprisingly ordinary. It didn't deploy new warships or announce a military operation. Instead, it submitted an official nautical chart of Scarborough Shoal to the United Nations. That chart defines what Manila considers the shoal's normal baselines, along with its 12 nautical mile territorial sea and 24 nautical mile contiguous zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. According to the Philippine government, the move wasn't about expanding its territory. It said the baselines were intended to reinforce the legal certainty of its existing maritime entitlements under international law. But Beijing saw something very different. China immediately declared the new baselines illegal and invalid, accused the Philippines of violating its territorial sovereignty, and insisted that Scarborough Shoal, known in China as Huangyandao, has always been Chinese territory. And China's response didn't stop there. Within a day, the People's Liberation Army and the China Coast Guard launched joint naval and air patrols around the disputed shoal, describing the operation as a defense of China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. What began as a legal filing had quickly turned into military signaling. So here's the question that drives the rest of this story. If the Philippines only submitted a map to the United Nations, why did China respond with warships and military aircraft instead of legal arguments alone? To understand China's reaction, we first need to understand one surprisingly simple idea. What exactly is a baseline? Think of a baseline as the starting line from which a country measures its maritime zones. Before international law can determine how far a country's rights extend into the sea, it first needs to know where those measurements begin. That's exactly what the Philippines submitted to the United Nations, a nautical chart showing the baselines it says should be used around Scarborough Shoal. From those baselines, international law measures areas such as the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, and, in some cases, parts of the continental shelf. Those measurements matter because they affect maritime enforcement, fishing rights, resource exploration, and other legal rights at sea. But here's the part that's often misunderstood. Baselines do not decide who owns a disputed feature. They define how maritime zones are measured, they do not settle sovereignty disputes. In other words, the Philippines wasn't asking the United Nations to give it new territory. It was setting out the legal framework for measuring maritime zones around territory it already claims. So if these baselines don't determine ownership, why did Beijing treat them as a strategic challenge rather than a routine legal filing? Because for China, this wasn't just about legal measurements. It was about what those measurements could mean for future claims. Diplomacy, and the broader balance of power in the South China Sea.
The Philippines and China clash for a third time this week in the South China Sea.
For Beijing, this wasn't just another legal disagreement. It was a challenge to a claim China has defended for years. China insists that Scarborough Shoal, known as Huangyandao, is its inherent territory. From Beijing's perspective, if the Philippines draws official baselines around the shoal, it creates the impression that Manila has the legal authority to define maritime zones around an area China says belongs to it. That's why China's foreign ministry moved so quickly. It called the Philippine baselines illegal and invalid, accused Manila of violating China's territorial sovereignty, and once again rejected the 2016 South China Sea arbitration ruling, maintaining that it has no legal force over China's claims. But Beijing's concern goes beyond this single map. In territorial disputes, governments often worry not only about who controls an area today, but also about what future actions might strengthen the other side's position. From China's perspective, allowing the Philippines' legal move to go unanswered could be interpreted as weakening Beijing's own long-standing claim. That helps explain why China's response didn't stop at diplomacy. Just one day later, the People's Liberation Army and the China Coast Guard carried out joint naval and air patrols around Scarborough Shoal. Chinese military officials described the drills as a necessary response to actions they said were undermining regional peace and stability. They also said the exercises were designed to improve combat readiness and defend China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights. At the same time, Chinese authorities announced stronger law enforcement measures around what they call the Wangyan Island National Nature Reserve, including regular Coast Guard patrols and stricter enforcement against unauthorized activities in the area. Together, these steps delivered a broader message. Beijing wasn't only rejecting the Philippines' legal position, it was reinforcing its own claim with diplomatic statements, military operations, and administrative measures. But that leads to an even bigger question. If China already maintains a constant presence around Scarborough Shoal, why is it still so sensitive to legal actions taken by the Philippines? Because the answer isn't found only in international law. It's found in Scarborough Shoal's strategic importance and why both Beijing and Manila believe it is far too valuable to ignore. At first glance, Scarborough Shoal doesn't look particularly important. It's a small ring of reefs and rocks, most of which disappear beneath the waves at high tide. So why has it become one of the most contested places in Asia? The answer begins with where it is. Scarborough Shoal lies only about 124 nautical miles from the Philippine island of Luzon, well within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. Yet, it also sits inside an area claimed by China under its broader South China Sea claims. That location makes it strategically valuable. It sits near some of the world's busiest shipping routes where trillions of dollars in global trade pass every year. While commercial ships don't necessarily sail directly through the shoal itself, maintaining a presence nearby gives China greater awareness of activity in one of the world's most important maritime regions. The waters around Scarborough Shoal are also among the richest fishing grounds in the South China Sea. For generations, Filipino fishermen have depended on these waters for their livelihoods, making the dispute not only a geopolitical issue, but also an economic and human one. Beneath the seabed, the wider South China Sea is also believed to contain significant oil and natural gas resources. Although the exact reserves around Scarborough remain uncertain, energy security is one of several reasons the region attracts such intense attention from competing claimants. Then there's the military dimension. A sustained presence around Scarborough allows China to monitor activity near the western coast of Luzon and operate alongside its Coast Guard, Navy, and air assets. It also strengthens Beijing's broader strategy of maintaining a continuous presence across key areas of the South China Sea, alongside features it already occupies elsewhere. This matters beyond China and the Philippines. The South China Sea has become a major focus of security cooperation between the Philippines and its allies, particularly the United States. As Manila expands defense cooperation and conducts more joint exercises with partners, every new confrontation around Scarborough is watched closely not just in Beijing and Manila, but also in Washington, Tokyo, and other regional capitals. Seen from this perspective, Scarborough Shoal is no longer just a disputed reef. It is a strategic crossroads where geography, natural resources, military positioning, and competing national interests all intersect. And that helps explain why China responded so strongly to what appeared to be a simple legal filing. But that raises another important question. If both sides believe international law supports their position, what does international law actually say about Scarborough Shoal, and does it settle this dispute at all? By now, you might be wondering, if both China and the Philippines insist they're right, what does international law actually say? The answer isn't as simple as many headlines suggest. Let's break it down into three key questions. First, who actually owns Scarborough Shoal? The short answer is international law has not settled that question. Both China and the Philippines claim sovereignty over the shoal, and neither side has accepted the other's claim. That means ownership of Scarborough Shoal remains disputed. Second, what did the 2016 South China Sea Tribunal actually decide? This is where many people get confused. The tribunal did not decide who owns Scarborough Shoal. Instead, it ruled that China's claim to historic rights inside the so-called 9-dash line has no legal basis under UNCLOS. The tribunal also concluded that Scarborough Shoal is not legally entitled to generate its own 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone because of its status under the convention. However, it deliberately did not rule on sovereignty, because that issue was outside its jurisdiction. In other words, the ruling clarified important maritime rights, but it did not decide who owns Scarborough Shoal. Third, do the Philippines' new baselines change international law? Not by themselves. The new baselines strengthen the Philippines' legal position under its own domestic legislation and explain how Manila measures its maritime zones. But they do not automatically change international law, nor do they settle the sovereignty dispute with China. That's why both countries continue to interpret the same events so differently. For Manila, the baselines reinforce what it considers its lawful maritime entitlements. For Beijing, they represent a unilateral action around territory China claims as its own. So despite the legal language, this dispute isn't ending in a courtroom anytime soon. It's continuing at sea through Coast Guard patrols, military operations, diplomatic protests, and competing efforts to reinforce each side's position. And that raises another important question. If international law alone cannot resolve this dispute, is China trying to create a new reality on the water? By now, one thing is becoming clear. China's response wasn't just about the Philippines' new baselines. It fits into a much broader pattern that has been unfolding for years. Since taking de facto control of Scarborough Shoal in 2012, Beijing has steadily expanded its presence through regular Coast Guard patrols, maritime militia vessels, and administrative measures designed to reinforce its claims. In 2025, China established the Huangyan Island National Nature Reserve. Then, earlier this year, satellite images revealed a floating platform near the shoal, prompting Manila to warn against any attempt to create another artificial island. China, however, said its activities there were legitimate. Now, following the Philippines' latest legal move, China has added another layer: joint naval and air patrols, stronger Coast Guard enforcement, and regular patrols around the nature reserve. Viewed separately, these actions may seem routine, but together, they reveal a consistent pattern, combining legal, administrative, Coast Guard, and military tools to maintain a continuous presence around Scarborough Shoal. Supporters of Beijing see these measures as protecting Chinese territory. The Philippines and many outside observers view them as gradually strengthening China's control over disputed waters. And that leads to the bigger question. Is China simply responding to today's baselines, or is it shaping tomorrow's reality in the South China Sea? The Philippines' new baselines may have started as a legal move, but their consequences are likely to play out far beyond the courtroom. In the short term, tensions around Scarborough Shoal are unlikely to disappear. More Coast Guard encounters, increased military patrols, and continued diplomatic protests could become part of the new normal, keeping fishermen and frontline personnel at the center of an increasingly contested maritime space. Recent confrontations, including dangerous close encounters and China's latest joint naval and air patrols, suggest that the risk of incidents at sea remains high. Over the longer term, the strategic competition is expected to deepen rather than fade. The Philippines has steadily expanded defense cooperation with the United States, Japan, and other partners through larger and more frequent joint exercises, while China continues to reinforce its presence through Coast Guard patrols, administrative measures, and military operations. As both sides strengthen their positions, the space for compromise could become even narrower. But this story doesn't have only one possible ending. Diplomatic channels remain open. While a code of conduct would not resolve the sovereignty dispute, it could establish clearer rules for managing incidents at sea and reducing the risk of dangerous miscalculations. Ultimately, neither China nor the Philippines appears willing to abandon its claims. That means the real challenge is no longer deciding who is right, but how to prevent rivalry from turning into conflict. Scarborough Shoal may be only a small cluster of reefs in the South China Sea, but it has become a symbol of a much larger contest won over sovereignty, security, international law, and the future balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. The Philippines believes it is reinforcing its rights through legal and diplomatic means. China believes it is defending territory it has always claimed. As both sides continue to assert their positions, the future of this dispute will depend not only on maps or legal arguments, but on whether deterrence and dialogue can coexist before the next confrontation at sea. At its core, This dispute was never just about a new set of baselines. It is about two countries trying to shape the future of one of the world's most strategically important seas. The Philippines believes it is reinforcing its maritime rights through domestic law and the legal framework established by UNCLOS. China believes those same actions challenge what it considers its sovereignty and has responded by strengthening its diplomatic, administrative, and military presence around Scarborough Shoal. Neither side appears willing to back down. That means the real contest is no longer just over maps or legal documents. It is over who defines the rules of the South China Sea through international law, through presence at sea, or through a combination of both. For now, the dispute remains below the threshold of armed conflict. But every new patrol, every legal filing, every diplomatic protest, and every military exercise adds another layer to an already fragile situation. The challenge for both Beijing and Manila is not simply defending their claims. It is ensuring that competition does not become confrontation. Because in the South China Sea, the next crisis may not begin with a missile or a warship. It may begin with something as simple as another line on a map.
We still don't know what they're conducting, but I would like to believe that the Chinese research vessel presence is the reason why they have a platform there.
In 2012, China took control of Scarborough Shoal without firing a single shot. No missiles, no invasion fleet, no declaration of war. Just a standoff, a diplomatic miscalculation, and a withdrawal that never reversed itself. More than a decade later, Chinese Coast Guard vessels still control access to the lagoon. Philippine fishermen, men who fish these waters for generations, enter and leave at Beijing's discretion. And now, in 2026, something new is happening at Scarborough Shoal. Something that has Philippine officials and regional security analysts deeply concerned.
It appears that the new maritime assets that the Chinese are deploying in Bajo de Masinloc and in other parts of Calayan Island Group are pretty much using the cover of marine scientific research.
Since October 2025, Philippine authorities have documented 8 buoys, antennas, and structures installed at various locations around the shoal. A floating structure, approximately 6 by 6 meters, fitted with what appears to be an antenna, and reportedly manned, was spotted anchored inside the lagoon itself. China installed a floating barrier roughly 352 meters long across the shoal's entrance in April 2026. The China Coast Guard doubled its vessel presence. And Beijing's explanation, delivered through its foreign ministry, was the same line it has used for years: scientific research. Nobody in Manila believes that. And increasingly, nobody in Washington, Tokyo, or Canberra believes it either. The question is no longer who controls Scarborough Shoal today. The question is whether that control is becoming irreversible, and what the consequences will be if it does. Scarborough Shoal, known in the Philippines as Bajo de Masinloc, is a small atoll in the South China Sea located roughly 220 kilometers west of Luzon, the Philippines' main island. It sits well within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. For context, Scarborough Shoal is more than 800 kilometers from the Chinese mainland. It is closer to Manila than Manila is to Cebu. It sits in waters that Philippine fishermen have worked for centuries, sustaining thousands of coastal livelihoods across the archipelago. The shoal is rich in marine life. Its lagoon provides shelter for fishing vessels in rough weather. Its strategic location gives whoever controls it a commanding view of the northeastern South China Sea, the main corridor between the Pacific Ocean and the Philippine Sea, and a critical choke point near the first island chain that American strategists consider essential to Indo-Pacific security architecture. This is not a remote, worthless reef. It is a strategically vital piece of geography, and China understands exactly what it is worth. The 2012 standoff began as a law enforcement action. Philippine Navy personnel attempted to detain Chinese fishermen found operating illegally inside the shoal. Chinese maritime vessels intervened, blocking the Navy's path. A tense standoff followed, lasting months. What happened next was a masterclass in gray zone statecraft. The United States brokered a deal under which both sides would withdraw their vessels simultaneously. The Philippines complied. China did not. Chinese vessels remained. Philippine ships stayed away. And in the absence of any formal treaty obligation that would trigger a U.S. military response, the situation simply solidified. No formal annexation occurred. No military occupation was declared. China never planted a flag in the legal sense that international law recognizes. Yet the outcome was functionally identical to conquest. China gained effective control of Scarborough Shoal through presence, patience, and a calculated willingness to exploit the gap between what international law says and what the international community is willing to enforce. The 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling under UNCLOS declared China's historical claims in the area invalid. China rejected the ruling outright and has never complied with it. The ruling exists. The enforcement mechanism does not. Here is the strategic concept that defines what is happening at Scarborough Shoal and across the South China Sea more broadly.
In accordance with the Republic Act 12064, the Philippine Maritime Zones Act, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea.
China does not need to formally annex territory to control it. It does not need to raise a flag, build a military base, or declare sovereignty in a way that triggers an international legal or military response. What it needs is presence. Consistent, persistent, escalating presence. Control can be exercised through Coast Guard patrols that deny access to foreign fishermen, through maritime militia vessels that anchor in contested waters and simply refuse to leave, through floating barriers that block entry to lagoons, through buoys and antennas that turn an empty reef into a monitoring node, through administrative declarations like China's announcement of a national nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal that create the bureaucratic architecture of sovereignty without the triggering conditions of annexation.
The China Coast Guard vessel 3301. This is Philippine Coast Guard vessel BRP.
Each individual action, taken in isolation, falls below the threshold that would compel a military response. None of them individually constitutes an act of war, but cumulatively, over years and decades, they amount to the same outcome that a military conquest would achieve. Without the political costs, without the international backlash, and without the risk of direct confrontation with the United States. This is the core insight of China's South China Sea strategy. The more permanent the presence becomes, the harder it becomes to reverse. Not because the law changes, but because the political and military cost of reversing the facts on the water rises with every passing month. What changed between 2012 and today is not simply the passage of time. The pattern of Chinese behavior at Scarborough Shoal has shifted in ways that suggest a qualitative escalation, a move from passive control to active consolidation. Between October 2025 and June 2026, Philippine authorities documented a systematic installation of structures inside and around the shoal. 8 buoys and antennas. A floating platform manned with personnel inside the lagoon itself. A 352-meter floating barrier blocking the entrance. And a China Coast Guard presence that, according to Philippine Navy records, doubled in vessel numbers during the same period.
If we're going to look at the chronological order of events, we can assume that the vessels that brought them there are actually Chinese research vessels. And until now, as we speak, there are still 2 Chinese research vessels that we are still monitoring inside Bajo de Masinloc.
China described the floating structure as scientific equipment. But Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro, speaking at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in May 2026, said he had received intelligence on the structure and was deeply concerned about its implications. The fear in Manila is not necessarily that Chinese Marines will land on Scarborough Shoal tomorrow morning. The fear is subtler and in some ways more alarming. It is the fear of gradual, irreversible consolidation. The fear that Beijing is doing to Scarborough Shoal what it did to Mischief Reef, to Fiery Cross, to Subi Reef, starting with small, deniable installations and ending with permanent, fortified presence that changes the strategic landscape permanently. Mischief Reef was once a small fishing shelter structure. Today, it is a militarized island with runway capacity, radar arrays, and the ability to support air and naval operations across a vast stretch of the South China Sea. The trajectory from then to now was exactly the kind of incremental escalation that is now being observed at Scarborough Shoal. To understand China's behavior at Scarborough Shoal, you have to understand the gray zone, the strategic space between peace and war where the most consequential territorial competition of our era is being conducted. Gray zone operations are designed to achieve strategic objectives without triggering the conditions that would compel a military response from the target state or its allies. They exploit the gap between what is legally prohibited and what is militarily provoked. They work through accumulation rather than sudden action. And they are particularly effective against states that lack the surveillance, the legal resources, or the political will to document and contest every individual incident. China's toolkit in the South China Sea is well established. Coast Guard deployments that enforce Chinese fishing regulations inside waters that international law assigns to other states. Maritime militia vessels that operate as a civilian buffer between PLA Navy assets and foreign forces. Administrative acts that create the bureaucratic appearance of sovereignty, and strategic communications that frame every Chinese action as defensive and every Philippine or allied response as provocative. The strategy works because it forces the target state into an impossible choice. Escalate militarily and risk a confrontation that your own population may not support and that your allies may not join. Accept the situation and allow the gradual consolidation of Chinese control to continue. Or pursue legal and diplomatic channels, which China simply ignores, as it has ignored the 2016 UNCLOS tribunal ruling for a decade. What makes the current moment different is that China appears to be moving beyond passive presence into active infrastructure installation. That is a significant escalation. Buoys can be removed. Floating barriers can be cut. But once permanent structures are established, once radar systems are installed, once personnel are rotated through a manned facility, the political and military cost of removal rises dramatically. China understands this, and the installation of structures inside Scarborough Shoal's lagoon suggests Beijing may be testing whether the moment has arrived to lock in its control permanently. Robert Kaplan wrote that in geopolitics, geography is fate. And the geography of Scarborough Shoal is precisely why this dispute matters far beyond the fishing rights of Philippine coastal communities, as important as those rights are. Scarborough Shoal sits approximately 220 kilometers from the northern coast of Luzon. And Luzon is where several of the new Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites that the United States has negotiated with the Philippines are located. These are the bases from which American forces could project power into the Taiwan Strait in the event of a conflict. Scarborough Shoal, in Chinese hands with monitoring infrastructure, becomes a surveillance node positioned almost perfectly to to track American force movements in the Philippine Sea. A militarized Scarborough Shoal, even one that stops short of a full military base, would extend China's maritime domain awareness southward and eastward into waters that American strategic planners consider critical. It would narrow the operating space available to Philippine and allied naval assets. It would give Beijing the ability to monitor and potentially interdict maritime traffic along sea lanes that connect the Pacific to the South China Sea. And it would complete the triangle of Chinese-controlled features, alongside the Spratly Islands to the south and the Paracel Islands to the north. That would allow Beijing to effectively dominate the South China Sea's northern approaches. The PLA Navy underscored this point in October 2025 when it conducted a live-fire exercise near Scarborough Shoal, timed deliberately to coincide with Exercise Sama Sama, a multinational maritime drill involving the United States, Australia, Canada, France, Japan, Italy, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. The message was unmistakable. This is Chinese space. You are operating near Chinese waters, and we are watching. The strategic equation at Scarborough Shoal cannot be understood without examining the American variable and the critical ambiguity at its center. The 1951 U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty commits the United States to respond to an armed attack on Philippine forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the Pacific, including in the South China Sea. Washington has repeatedly stated that the treaty applies to Philippine Coast Guard vessels and to Philippine government ships operating in the West Philippine Sea. The Biden administration said it explicitly. The Trump administration has affirmed it. But here is the problem. Gray zone operations are not armed attacks. A floating barrier is not a missile. A maritime militia vessel that blocks a Philippine fishing boat without firing a weapon does not clearly trigger the Mutual Defense Clause. China's strategy has been carefully calibrated to operate below the threshold of what would compel an automatic American military response. And so the strategic question becomes not whether the United States would respond to a Chinese invasion of Scarborough Shoal, it almost certainly would, but whether Washington is prepared to respond to the slow, incremental consolidation of Chinese control that falls short of invasion. History suggests the answer is complicated. The United States did not respond militarily when China seized control in 2012. It did not respond when China built artificial islands in the Spratlys. The pattern of non-response to gray zone operations, however legitimate the reasons in each individual case, has created a permissive environment that Beijing has exploited. American military engagement with the Philippines has increased significantly. In 2025, U.S. and Philippine forces conducted 8 major exercises. The Triton Autonomous Sea Drone transfer in June 2026 demonstrates Washington's commitment to enhancing Philippine maritime domain awareness. And MESIS anti-ship missiles were deployed during Balikatan 2025. The first island chain defense architecture is being reinforced. But the fundamental credibility question, what exactly Washington will do when China crosses a line that falls below the armed attack threshold, remains unanswered. And China knows it. Three strategic scenarios are plausible over the next 5 years, and none of them are comfortable for Manila. In the first scenario, the status quo continues. China maintains its presence at Scarborough Shoal, conducts occasional structural installations, and retreats when Philippine diplomatic protests generate sufficient international attention, as it did when it removed the floating structure after Manila's protest in June 2026. The shoal remains contested in theory, but controlled by China in practice. This scenario preserves a degree of ambiguity that both sides can manage. In the second scenario, China escalates toward permanent infrastructure. Manned facilities become permanent. Radar and monitoring systems are installed. A supply line is established. In the third scenario, sustained diplomatic pressure, legal documentation, improved Philippine maritime surveillance, and deepening alliance coordination create sufficient costs for Chinese gray zone operations that Beijing chooses to consolidate rather than expand, holding what it has rather than pushing further. This is not a resolution, but it is containment. And in the South China Sea, containment may be the most realistic near-term objective available to the Philippine-led coalition. The most likely outcome, as most serious analysts recognize, is a continuation of long-term competition rather than a sudden crisis. The trajectory is slow, but relentless. And that is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Scarborough Shoal is not simply about a reef. It never was. It is about how territorial control is established in the modern era, not through invasion and conquest, but through presence, persistence, and patience. It is about whether the rules-based maritime order that the post-World War II international community built can survive the systematic pressure of a great power that has chosen not to be bound by those rules. The structures appearing inside Scarborough Shoal's lagoon are small. A 6-by-6-meter floating platform with an antenna is not a military base. A floating barrier is not a warship. Individually, each Chinese action at Scarborough Shoal can be dismissed as minor, deniable, reversible. But that framing misses the strategic logic entirely. The accumulation of small, deniable, reversible actions is the strategy. It is not a series of accidents or isolated incidents. It is a systematic, patient, decades-long project to change the facts of the South China Sea without triggering the military response that would force a direct confrontation. The fear in Manila is rational, and it is not simply the fear that China will seize Scarborough Shoal tomorrow. It is the deeper, more unsettling fear that the seizure is already complete in every sense that matters, and that the world, distracted by other crises, will one day wake up and realize that the strategic geography of the Indo-Pacific changed while nobody was willing to pay the price of stopping it. The battle for Scarborough Shoal may not be decided by warships or missiles. It may be decided by which side can maintain its presence the longest, and which side has the strategic patience, the surveillance capability, and the alliance cohesion to make that presence too costly to sustain.
It appears that the new maritime assets that the Chinese are deploying in Bajo de Masinloc and in other parts of Calayan Island Group are pretty much using the cover of marine scientific.
At first glance, the removal of a floating structure near Scarborough Shoal may seem like a minor maritime incident. No shots were fired, no ships were sunk, no territory visibly changed hands. Yet the event quickly drew attention across the region. Why? Because in the South China Sea, small actions often reveal much larger strategic realities. For more than a decade, China has expanded its presence across disputed waters through Coast Guard patrols, maritime militia operations, infrastructure construction, and persistent pressure on rival claimants. The Philippines has increasingly pushed back, relying not only on its own maritime forces, but also on growing support from the United States and other regional partners. Against that backdrop, reports that a Chinese-linked floating structure had been removed from the vicinity of Scarborough Shoal raised an important question. Did China back down? Or was Beijing simply adjusting its tactics while pursuing the same long-term objectives? The answer matters because Scarborough Shoal is about far more than reefs or fishing grounds. It is part of a broader contest over power, influence, and control in the South China Sea. And understanding that contest requires looking beyond the headlines to the strategic forces driving all sides of this dispute. The latest issue in the South China Sea started when Philippine authorities detected a floating structure near Scarborough Shoal, one of the region's most contested maritime features. According to Manila, the structure appeared within waters that the Philippines considers part of its exclusive economic zone. Its presence immediately raised concerns. The issue was not simply the structure itself, but what it might represent. Over the past decade, seemingly minor activities in the South China Sea have often evolved into more permanent forms of control. As a result, even temporary installations are viewed through a broader strategic lens. Philippine authorities protested and closely monitored the situation.
This is the photo of the movable floating platform that we are currently monitoring in Bajo de Masinloc. It has a deck area of approximately 30 square meters. Roughly, the dimensions are 5 meter to 6 to 7 meter in length.
While analysts debated whether the structure was a routine maritime activity, a political signal, or part of a broader effort to strengthen China's presence around Scarborough Shoal, the United States also paid close attention. Although Washington did not view the incident as a military crisis, it fit into a wider pattern of maritime tensions that have increasingly shaped U.S. policy in the region. Then came the unexpected development. The structure was removed. Its disappearance immediately sparked a new debate. Some observers saw it as evidence that diplomatic pressure from the Philippines, backed by U.S. support and international scrutiny, had produced results. Others argued that such conclusions were premature. China announced no change in policy, nor did it signal any reduction in its claims or activities in the area. The removal of the structure did not resolve the dispute. It merely shifted the debate from what China was doing to why it chose to stop doing it. And before answering that question, we first need to understand why Scarborough Shoal remains one of the most strategically important flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. To understand why the appearance and eventual removal of a floating structure generated so much attention, one must first understand Scarborough Shoal itself. At first glance, Scarborough appears insignificant. It has no cities, no population, and little obvious value on a map. Yet strategic competition is rarely determined by size. More often, it is determined by location. And Scarborough Shoal occupies one of the most important locations in the South China Sea. The shoal lies roughly 200 kilometers from the Philippine island of Luzon, placing it well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. At the same time, it sits near critical sea lanes linking Northeast Asia to the wider Indo-Pacific. For the Philippines, Scarborough supports fishing communities and forms part of the country's maritime frontier. For China, its significance is far greater. Beijing's interests in the South China Sea extend well beyond fisheries. The region is a vital strategic corridor through which a large share of global trade passes. Control over key maritime features enhances surveillance, extends operational reach, and strengthens a state's ability to shape activity across surrounding waters. This is why Scarborough cannot be viewed in isolation. For Chinese strategists, it is not simply a reef, but another position within a broader network of influence stretching across the South China Sea. For the Philippines, it is also a reminder of 2012, when China established effective control over the shoal without firing a single shot. That history explains why even a temporary structure can trigger alarm. To understand why the recent floating structure generated concern in Manila, we need to go back to 2012. That year, a confrontation erupted after Philippine authorities attempted to detain Chinese fishing vessels operating near Scarborough Shoal. At first, the incident appeared routine. Maritime disputes are common in the South China Sea, and similar confrontations had occurred before. China quickly dispatched maritime surveillance vessels, preventing Philippine authorities from carrying out their enforcement actions. What began as a dispute over fishing boats soon evolved into a prolonged standoff between two governments. Following diplomatic efforts involving the United States, reports emerged that both sides would withdraw and de-escalate the crisis. The Philippines withdrew. China did not. Chinese vessels remained and gradually established a continuous presence around the shoal. Over time, Filipino fishermen faced increasing restrictions in waters they had traditionally used for generations. What made the episode remarkable was not how much force China used, but how little. No missiles were launched, No naval battle occurred. No territory was formally annexed. Yet, the strategic reality changed. China achieved what military theorists call a fait accompli, a situation in which control is established incrementally until it becomes the new normal. The lesson extended far beyond Scarborough Shoal. For many observers across Southeast Asia, the episode demonstrated a broader Chinese approach to maritime disputes, using Coast Guard vessels, maritime patrols, administrative measures, and persistent presence to alter facts at sea. This is why every new activity around Scarborough attracts attention today. The concern is not necessarily the activity itself. It is whether it represents the first step in a process that has been seen before. Scarborough Shoal was not an isolated case. To understand why developments there generate such strong reactions, it is necessary to examine the broader pattern of Chinese behavior across the South China Sea over the past 2 decades. One of the defining features of China's strategy has been its gradual nature. Rather than relying on military conquest, Beijing has often pursued a slower approach designed to strengthen its position while avoiding a major regional confrontation. The pattern has appeared repeatedly. First comes presence: fishing vessels, maritime militia ships, Coast Guard patrols, or research activities around a disputed feature. Then comes persistence: a continuous presence that reinforces China's claims and complicates access for rival claimants. Over time comes administration, as Chinese authorities increasingly act as if they possess jurisdiction over the area. And in some cases comes consolidation. Mischief Reef offers one of the clearest examples. What was once a little-known feature eventually became a heavily developed artificial island with an airstrip, port facilities, radar systems, and military infrastructure. Similar developments occurred at Fiery Cross Reef and Subi Reef. From Beijing's perspective, these projects strengthen China's ability to protect vital maritime interests. For neighboring states, they represent a gradual shift in the regional balance of power. This is what makes Scarborough Shoal so sensitive. Many Filipino analysts do not see merely a disputed shoal. They see the possibility of another step in a familiar sequence. Whether that concern is justified remains open to debate, but the historical record explains why even minor developments attract close scrutiny. Because the most significant changes in the South China Sea have rarely occurred overnight. They have emerged through a series of incremental actions that gradually reshape the strategic landscape. And that brings us to the next question. How did Filipinos react when another potential chapter in this story appeared to be unfolding at Scarborough Shoal? The appearance of the floating structure near Scarborough Shoal immediately raised concerns across the Philippines. But the reaction was not driven by the structure alone. It was driven by memory. For many Filipinos, Scarborough Shoal is more than a disputed maritime feature. It is a symbol of what many view as one of the most significant strategic setbacks in modern Philippine history. The events of 2012 remain deeply embedded in the national consciousness. China established effective control over the shoal despite its proximity to the Philippine coast and its location within what Manila considers its exclusive economic zone. As a result, any new Chinese activity in the area is often viewed through the lens of that experience. Among fishing communities, the concerns were practical. Scarborough has long been an important fishing ground, and restrictions on access have affected livelihoods, incomes, and local economies. Within the Philippine security establishment, the focus was different. Military planners and maritime analysts viewed the structure not as an immediate threat, but as a possible indicator of future intentions. The concern was that it might represent the beginning of a process that had already unfolded elsewhere in the South China Sea. Public sentiment reflected these anxieties. Over the past decade, distrust of China has grown among many Filipinos, while support for closer security cooperation with the United States and other partners has generally increased. From the Philippine perspective, the lesson of Scarborough Shoal is clear. Strategic realities in the South China Sea can change gradually, and by the time those changes become obvious, they may already be difficult to reverse. From Washington's perspective, Scarborough Shoal has never been simply about a reef, or even the Philippines itself. It is part of a much larger question. Who will shape the balance of power in the Western Pacific? For decades after the Cold War, the United States enjoyed unrivaled naval dominance across Asia's maritime corridors. But China's rise has increasingly challenged that reality. As Beijing expanded its presence across the South China Sea, American policymakers became less concerned with individual incidents and more concerned with their cumulative effect.
Provide the following: name of vessel, intention, last and next port of call on Channel 16.
A Coast Guard patrol, a new structure, a maritime standoff, or an artificial island may appear insignificant on its own. Together, however, they can gradually reshape the strategic environment. This helps explain why the United States has deepened security cooperation with the Philippines in recent years. Joint military exercises have expanded, access to Philippine bases has increased, and Washington has repeatedly reaffirmed its alliance commitments to Manila. Against that backdrop, the floating structure attracted attention not because of what it was, but because of what it might signal. Would it become another step in China's effort to strengthen its position in the South China Sea? Or would resistance from the Philippines, backed by American support, impose meaningful limits on Beijing's actions? When the structure was eventually removed, some saw it as evidence that coordinated pressure had worked. But for Washington, the larger lesson was that competition in the South China Sea is increasingly becoming a test of endurance, credibility, and political will. As news of the floating structure spread, reactions extended far beyond China and the Philippines. What appeared to be a local maritime dispute was increasingly viewed through the broader lens of Indo-Pacific security. Across Southeast Asia, governments watched closely. Many ASEAN states have their own maritime disputes with China and saw the incident as part of a larger question. If China can steadily strengthen its position around one disputed feature, what might that mean for others in the future? Japan and Australia viewed the issue through a similar strategic lens. Both have become increasingly concerned about shifts in the regional balance of power and have strengthened security cooperation with the Philippines. For them, incidents such as Scarborough are not simply bilateral disputes, but tests of the rules and norms that underpin regional stability. Even Europe has become more attentive. As a significant share of global trade passes through Indo-Pacific sea lanes, instability in the South China Sea carries economic consequences far beyond Asia. The incident also revived attention on the 2016 arbitral ruling, which rejected many of China's expansive claims in the South China Sea. While Beijing continues to reject the ruling, much of the international community still regards it as an important legal reference point. Yet it would be a mistake to conclude that China was isolated. Many countries remain deeply tied to Beijing economically and prefer to avoid choosing sides. The more accurate assessment is that China faced growing scrutiny rather than overwhelming pressure. And that brings us to the central question of this story: did China remove the structure because of that pressure, or were other calculations at work? At first glance, the removal of the floating structure appeared to be a victory for the Philippines. The sequence seemed straightforward. The structure appeared, Manila protested, international attention followed, the United States voiced support, and then the structure disappeared. For many observers, the conclusion was obvious: China had backed down. But geopolitics is rarely that simple. Great powers do not usually abandon long-term strategic objectives because of a single diplomatic protest or a few weeks of negative headlines. They tend to think in terms of decades rather than days. The key question, therefore, is not whether pressure existed. Clearly, it did. The more important question is whether that pressure changed China's cost-benefit calculation. One possibility is that Beijing concluded the structure was generating more political attention than strategic value. Another is that it had already served its purpose, whether gathering information, testing reactions, or signaling Chinese presence. A third possibility is that China simply chose to avoid creating another flashpoint at a time of broader strategic challenges. None of these explanations require China to abandon its claims. And that is the critical point. The removal of the structure does not mean China has changed its position on Scarborough Shoal. Chinese vessels continue to operate in the area, and Beijing's broader objective of expanding its influence in the South China Sea remains unchanged. If anything, the episode suggests something more subtle. China may be willing to adjust tactics when costs rise, but not necessarily alter its long-term strategy. If the removal of the floating structure does not signal a Chinese retreat, what comes next? The most likely answer is neither war nor peace, but a prolonged period of strategic competition. The fundamental interests of both sides remain unchanged. China continues to view the South China Sea as vital to its security, maritime access, economic interests, and broader ambition to become the dominant power in East Asia. The Philippines, meanwhile, sees the same waters as essential to its sovereignty, economy, and national security. Because these interests are unlikely to disappear, future tensions will most likely emerge through what analysts call gray zone competition. Activities that fall below the threshold of war but still seek to alter the strategic environment. The Philippines should therefore expect continued Coast Guard encounters, maritime patrols, fishing disputes, and competing claims of jurisdiction. Information campaigns, legal disputes, and diplomatic pressure are also likely to intensify, while China's growing maritime capabilities will give Beijing more tools to sustain its presence across contested waters. For Manila, the challenge is not responding to a single incident. It is managing a long-term competition that could last for decades. The most important lesson from Scarborough Shoal is that strategic contests are rarely decided by dramatic events. More often, they are shaped by persistence, by who remains present, maintains alliances, and sustains political will over time. The South China Sea is unlikely to witness a decisive victory for either side in the near future. Instead, it will remain a steady contest over influence, access, and control. And that raises the final question: what is the most sustainable path forward for the Philippines? The central challenge facing the Philippines is not simply how to respond to China, it is how to protect its interests while living beside a much larger and more powerful neighbor. History shows that small and middle powers rarely succeed by matching great powers ship for ship or dollar for dollar. Instead, they succeed through resilience, diplomacy, partnerships, and strategic patience. For Manila, the first priority is strengthening maritime awareness. A country cannot defend what it cannot see. Investments in surveillance systems, Coast Guard capabilities, maritime patrol aircraft, drones, and intelligence sharing networks are likely to prove more valuable than dramatic displays of force. The second priority is maintaining strong partnerships. The Philippines does not need to contain China, but it must avoid isolation. Closer cooperation with the United States, Japan, Australia, and other partners helps raise the costs of coercion and strengthens deterrence. At the same time, realism requires acknowledging a basic fact: China is not going anywhere. It will remain a major economic partner, a powerful neighbor, and a central actor in regional affairs for decades to come. That means diplomacy cannot be abandoned. Communication channels must remain open, even during periods of tension. The objective should be neither confrontation nor accommodation, but stability. Most importantly, Manila must recognize that the South China Sea dispute is a long-term strategic competition. Success will depend less on dramatic victories and more on national capacity, economic strength, political unity, and consistent policy. In the end, the lesson of Scarborough Shoal is simple. The future of the South China Sea will be shaped by persistence rather than headlines. For the Philippines, the most sustainable path forward lies between resistance and realism.
Scarborough Shoal.
Scarborough Shoal.
There's been a lot of activity on the high seas of Southeast Asia, with the Philippines and China moving around an area known as the Scarborough Shoal.
These activities were again revived. VK 1991.
And screening for the landing force.
The prospect of Scarborough Shoal becoming a permanent Chinese military base would mark one of the most consequential strategic ruptures in the South China Sea since China's island-building surge of the mid-2010s. What was once a quiet fishing ground, known as Huangyuan Dao in China and Bajo de Masinloc in the Philippines, has evolved into a geopolitical fulcrum where sovereignty, alliance credibility, and international law collide. Since China seized de facto control of the shoal in 2012 after a standoff with the Philippines, Scarborough has become a symbol not merely of territorial dispute, but of whether legal rulings in smaller states still matter in an era of great power competition. Unlike China's earlier militarization of the Spratly Islands or the Paracel Islands, Scarborough represents a different order of escalation. It is closer to a treaty ally's mainland, embedded in vital sea lines of communication, and subject to a clear international legal ruling. A base here would not be incremental, it would be transformational. Just as Russia's seizure and militarization of Crimea reshaped the Black Sea balance, or China's pressure around Taiwan has redrawn assumptions in the Western Pacific, Scarborough would redraw the strategic map of Southeast Asia almost overnight.
On whether there can be joint development with China on our exclusive economic zone, my opinion is it's not possible because under the Constitution, there's a provision there which says that the use and enjoyment of the exclusive economic zone shall be reserved exclusively to Filipinos.
The legal stakes are unusually stark. An international arbitral tribunal ruled in 2016 that Scarborough Shoal lies within the Philippine exclusive economic zone, and that China's 9-dash line has no legal basis. If Beijing were to militarize the feature anyway, it would signal that binding legal judgments can be ignored when power allows, setting a precedent with implications far beyond Asia, from the Arctic to the Eastern Mediterranean. The question then becomes unavoidable. If international law fails at Scarborough, where does it still hold? Strategically, a base on Scarborough would close a critical gap in China's South China Sea posture, enabling near-continuous surveillance, missile coverage, and pressure across the region. It would place northern Luzon within direct military reach, compress warning times for Philippine and U.S. forces, and complicate freedom of navigation operations. For Washington, it would test alliance commitments in a way no artificial island ever has, bringing the Mutual Defense Treaty from legal abstraction into potential operational reality. For the Philippines, the implications would be existential rather than theoretical. Loss of fishing access, heightened vulnerability of key bases, domestic political pressure to respond, and the risk of being strategically encircled. For ASEAN, it would expose the limits of consensus and centrality. For U.S. allies such as Japan and Australia, it would reinforce the logic of tighter security alignment. And for the global system, it would accelerate a trend already visible, from Ukraine to the Red Sea, where power increasingly overrides rules. This leads to the core question that defines the entire debate. What would actually change, strategically, legally, and politically, if China built a military base on Scarborough Shoal? The answer is sobering. It would tilt the regional balance of power, escalate tensions with Manila and Washington, hollow out the credibility of international maritime law, and harden the Indo-Pacific into a more polarized and militarized security environment. In that sense, Scarborough Shoal is not just another disputed feature, it is a stress test for the future of maritime order itself. Geography explains much of Scarborough Shoal's significance. The reef lies roughly 220 kilometers west of Luzon, placing it well within the Philippines' 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. It also sits near major sea lines of communication that carry trillions of dollars in global trade annually through the South China Sea. While the shoal itself is small, its location magnifies its strategic weight far beyond its physical footprint. From a military perspective, Scarborough Shoal occupies a crossroads between the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea. A militarized presence would allow China to monitor air and naval traffic entering and exiting the Luzon Strait, extend radar and missile coverage toward northern Philippines and potentially southern Japan, and close what many defense planners see as a strategic gap between Chinese positions in the Paracels to the north and the Spratlys to the south. One senior U.S. defense official famously described Scarborough as the missing piece in China's South China Sea chessboard, a phrase that captures its connective role in Beijing's broader maritime strategy. Economically and environmentally, the shoal also matters deeply to the Philippines. For generations, it has served as a traditional fishing ground for thousands of Filipino fishermen. The surrounding waters are believed to hold potential hydrocarbon resources linked to the broader Luzon basin. Ecologically, Scarborough is a sensitive coral reef system that has already suffered degradation from overfishing and episodic dredging. Militarization would likely accelerate environmental damage, compounding economic losses with ecological harm. Symbolically, Scarborough Shoal has become a litmus test. It tests Philippine sovereignty, ASEAN's credibility as a regional organization, and the enforceability of international law. What happens there signals whether small and middle powers can rely on legal norms or whether raw power will ultimately prevail.
I continue to find ways to redefine our relationship with China. And I really believe that the way forward is to change. Because when you talk about China and the Philippines, all you talk about are the territorial disputes.
The legal framework governing Scarborough Shoal is unusually clear by the standards of the South China Sea. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, coastal states possess sovereign rights over resources within their exclusive economic zones, while low-tide elevations like Scarborough cannot generate territorial seas or EEZs of their own. This framework was reinforced decisively in 2016, when an arbitral tribunal constituted under UNCLOS ruled in favor of the Philippines in its case against China. To understand why Beijing might consider such a move, one must view Scarborough Shoal within China's broader strategic vision. A base there would consolidate the 9-dash line by completing a strategic triangle linking the Paracel Islands in the north, the Spratly Islands in the south, and Scarborough Shoal to the east. This would allow China to exert near-continuous surveillance and pressure across the South China Sea. From a military standpoint, Scarborough would be ideal for expanding China's anti-access, area denial posture. Potential deployments could include long-range surface-to-air missiles, anti-ship cruise missiles, advanced radar systems, and electronic warfare capabilities. Such assets would complicate U.S. and allied operations, raise the costs of freedom of navigation missions, and compress response times in any crisis. Scarborough would also strengthen China's gray zone coercion toolkit. By backing Coast Guard and maritime militia operations with hardened military infrastructure, Beijing could apply sustained pressure on the Philippines while staying below the threshold of open conflict. Domestic politics further reinforce this logic. Nationalist narratives around sovereignty play well at home, particularly during periods of economic or political strain, providing incentives for assertive actions abroad. At the strategic level, Chinese defense white papers emphasize dominance of the near seas and the reduction of U.S. military influence in East Asia. Scarborough Shoal fits squarely into that long-term vision. A military base on Scarborough Shoal would have immediate and far-reaching military consequences. Infrastructure could include runways capable of hosting fighter aircraft, intelligence and surveillance installations, missile batteries, hardened shelters, and naval resupply facilities. Even a modest footprint would significantly alter the regional military balance. For the Philippines, the implications would be severe. Luzon's western coast would fall within direct missile range, reducing warning time and increasing vulnerability. Key installations, including Philippine Air Force bases, would face heightened risk. The psychological effect would be just as important as the physical one, reinforcing perceptions of encirclement and strategic disadvantage. For the United States, Scarborough would complicate operational planning under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Forces rotating through EDCA sites would operate under greater risk. Freedom of navigation operations would become more complex, and higher levels of readiness and dispersion would be required. A former U.S. Indo-Pacific commander summed it up bluntly. Scarborough Shoal would be a game changer, militarily, politically, and psychologically. Dense deployments also raise escalation risks. Accidents, miscalculations, or misinterpreted signals could rapidly spiral from gray zone confrontation into kinetic conflict, especially given alliance commitments and compressed decision-making timelines. For Manila, militarization would be a national security shock. It would mean the effective loss of access to traditional fishing grounds, strategic pressure on Luzon, and a reduction in deterrence credibility. Domestic politics would be equally affected, with pressure on leaders to respond decisively and a surge in nationalist sentiment that could polarize society. Alliance dynamics would come to the fore. Militarization could force clearer interpretations or even activation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. In 2023, Washington reaffirmed that any armed attack on Philippine forces in the South China Sea would invoke the treaty, making Scarborough a direct test of alliance credibility. Economic costs would also mount. Fishing livelihoods would decline, investor confidence could weaken, and insurance costs for shipping might rise, affecting broader economic stability. Across Southeast Asia, a Chinese decision to construct a permanent military base on Scarborough Shoal would trigger widespread unease, but not a unified response. Within ASEAN, reactions would be shaped by geography, threat perception, and economic exposure to China. Claimant states such as Vietnam and Malaysia would be deeply alarmed, viewing militarization as confirmation that Beijing is willing to convert de facto control into permanent military dominance, despite international legal rulings. For Hanoi in particular, Scarborough would reinforce fears that China's island militarization is not limited to isolated features, but part of a methodical campaign to lock in control across the entire South China Sea. By contrast, non-claimant ASEAN members would face a more complex dilemma. While states such as Indonesia, Thailand, and Cambodia share concerns about regional instability and freedom of navigation, many would hesitate to take an overtly confrontational stance. China's role as a top trading partner, investor, and source of infrastructure financing exerts powerful gravitational pull, encouraging diplomatic caution. The likely outcome would be familiar: carefully worded statements calling for restraint and dialogue, coupled with an unwillingness to endorse collective countermeasures. This divergence would further erode ASEAN consensus and weaken its claim to centrality in regional security affairs, reinforcing perceptions that the organization struggles to manage great power rivalry within its own maritime neighborhood. For the United States, a militarized Scarborough Shoal would represent a direct strategic and alliance challenge. Washington would almost certainly respond with strong diplomatic condemnation, framing the move as a violation of international law and a threat to regional stability. More importantly, it would accelerate practical military adjustments, expanded rotational deployments, increased maritime and air patrols, and deeper defense cooperation with the Philippines under existing alliance frameworks. Scarborough's proximity to Luzon would make it impossible for U.S. planners to treat the issue as abstract or peripheral. Instead, it would become a core contingency shaping force posture, operational planning, and alliance signaling. U.S. treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific would respond by tightening security coordination. Japan, already acutely sensitive to Chinese pressure in the East China Sea and around Taiwan, would likely view Scarborough as another data point confirming the need for stronger deterrence and deeper integration with U.S. and Philippine forces. Australia would similarly interpret militarization as justification for expanded joint exercises, intelligence sharing, and maritime cooperation across Southeast Asia. South Korea, while more cautious due to its proximity to North Korea, would face growing pressure to align more closely with U.S.-led regional security efforts as Indo-Pacific dynamics become increasingly interconnected. Beyond the region, European actors would also become more visible. France, the United Kingdom, and Germany have all framed freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific as a matter of global interest rather than regional politics. A Chinese base at Scarborough would likely prompt these countries to expand naval deployments, participate more actively in multilateral exercises, and raise the issue in international forums. While European involvement would not alter the military balance directly, it would internationalize the dispute further, reinforcing the narrative that Scarborough is not just a bilateral or regional issue, but a test case for global maritime norms. The cumulative effect of these reactions would be strategic polarization. Rather than restoring stability, militarization would harden divisions, accelerate bloc formation, and reduce diplomatic maneuvering space. On one side would be an increasingly networked group of U.S. allies and partners, emphasizing deterrence, interoperability, and presence. On the other, China would double down on its narrative of resisting external interference while consolidating its position on the ground, or rather, at sea. In this environment, Scarborough Shoal would cease to be a localized dispute and instead function as a catalyst, accelerating the transformation of the Indo-Pacific from a contested region into a structurally divided security system. Perhaps the most far-reaching consequences would be normative. Ignoring a binding arbitral ruling would undermine UNCLOS, weaken peaceful dispute resolution, and normalize militarization of disputed features. Other states might feel compelled to fortify their own claims, triggering an arms race. Freedom of navigation would face new risks, with the possibility of coercive inspections or exclusion zones. Globally, failure to respond effectively would signal that power, not law, determines outcomes, eroding confidence in international governance well beyond Southeast Asia. In the short term, militarization would trigger diplomatic protests and military signaling. Over the medium term, arms buildups and gray zone confrontations would become more frequent. In the worst case, armed clashes could draw in U.S. forces under alliance commitments, with rapid escalation driven by limited communication channels and ambiguous red lines. Crisis management would be especially challenging. Decision makers would face compressed timelines, incomplete information, and intense domestic pressure, increasing the risk of miscalculation. For the Philippines, priorities would include legal and diplomatic coalition building, defense modernization, and expanded cooperation with allies and partners. For the United States, clear deterrence signaling, treaty clarification, and sustained presence without provocation would be essential. Risk reduction measures such as crisis hotlines, confidence-building mechanisms, and agreed rules of engagement would be vital to prevent escalation. Scarborough Shoal is more than a reef. It is a test of international law, alliance credibility, and regional peace. Militarization would mark a strategic inflection point, accelerating militarization and polarization across the Indo-Pacific. Ultimately, the question is not only what China might build, but what the world is prepared to defend. How Scarborough Shoal is handled will shape the future of maritime governance and great power relations for decades to come. If you liked the video, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for deep analysis of contemporary issues.
To China Coast Guard Vessel 4305, this is Philippine Coast Guard Vessel BRP Teresa Magbanwa, MRRV 9701.
In December 2025, new satellite evidence from BBC Verify exposed a dramatic escalation in China's naval posture across the Philippine Sea, revealing flotillas being resupplied at sea, far from home, and operating with the endurance of a true blue water navy. What Philippine forces have been warning about for months is now visible from orbit. China has shifted from episodic patrols to sustained power projection, deploying destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, and militia units in a coordinated pattern that stretches from the Miyako Strait to Scarborough Shoal. This sustained presence is not happening in isolation. The Philippines recorded 19 Chinese warships in November alone, part of a broader surge that mirrors the intensity of China's pressure on Vietnam's Vanguard Bank and Malaysia's energy fields near Luconia Shoals, but with far more aggressive tactics, including helicopter shadowing, water cannon blasts, and the placement of territorial buoys inside another nation's EEZ. Meanwhile, Japan, Australia, and even India are observing similar Chinese logistics activity in their own maritime regions. Japan intercepted a Chinese survey vessel near Okino Torishima in November. Australia monitored PLA Navy ships refueling near Christmas Island. And India tracked a Chinese research ship believed to be mapping routes toward the Malacca Strait. Together, these incidents reveal a regional pattern. China is rapidly expanding the reach of a navy that can now operate continuously, not just constantly. For the Philippines, however, the stakes are higher and more immediate. The PCG has documented a 30 to 40% surge in Chinese vessels around 'Ayungin' and 'Scarborough' since mid-2025.
「 Philippines Coast Guard Vessel 4305. This is Philippine Coast Guard Vessel BRP Teresa Magbanwa, MRRV 9701.
2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. 2025. These flotillas now include destroyers loitering for months, militia boats returning after long absences, and Coast Guard units that have escalated tactics to dangerous collisions, such as the August 2025 incident where a Chinese destroyer struck a CCG cutter while chasing a Filipino resupply mission. Countries like Japan and Vietnam respond with powerful navies of their own, equipped with Aegis destroyers and Kilo-class submarines. But the Philippines faces these incursions with a smaller fleet, relying instead on transparency flights, documentation, alliances, and modernization to counter China's attempt to normalize its presence. As a senior Filipino official warned, China is massing the pieces of a long game. And now, with fresh proof of extended resupply operations and sustained flotilla deployments, the picture is unmistakably clear. China is preparing for a semi-permanent posture in Philippine waters, a move that could redefine maritime security across the entire Indo-Pacific.
We have incoming on Sector 4.
The escalation became even more visible on 3 December 2025, when a routine maritime domain awareness flight by the Philippine Coast Guard detected an unusually large and mixed group of Chinese vessels gathered around Bajo de Masinloc. According to reports from Manila Standard, the PCG crew observed a layered presence. People's Liberation Army Navy warships, China Coast Guard cutters, maritime militia boats, and even anchored buoys, a familiar indicator of China's pattern of occupation and area denial. This was not the typical rotation of a few vessels enforcing a blockade. It was a comprehensive formation, structured and deliberate, showing that China maintains a semi-permanent posture around one of the Philippines' most strategically important maritime features. The legal implications of this presence are profound. Bajo de Masinloc lies squarely within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, as affirmed under Republic Act 12064 and reinforced by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS.
On whether there can be joint development with China on our exclusive economic zone, my opinion is it's not possible because under the Constitution, there's a provision there which says that the use and enjoyment of the exclusive economic zone shall be reserved exclusively to Filipinos.
More importantly, the 2016 Arbitral Award categorically ruled that China has no historic rights within the so-called 9-dash line, and that any attempts to enforce control around the shoal violate international law. By massing a blended fleet of naval, coast guard, and militia vessels, China is defying these rulings and challenging the Philippines' sovereign rights over its waters. In diplomatic terms, this is not a gray area. It is a direct legal contradiction to global maritime norms. What makes the December 3 incident more alarming is that it fits a growing pattern of escalation rather than a one-off encounter. China's presence near Scarborough Shoal has shifted from sporadic patrols to systematic, multi-layered coercion designed to normalize control. The combination of warships for deterrence, Coast Guard vessels for enforcement, militia boats for swarming tactics, and buoys for territorial marking reflects a strategy aimed at establishing de facto authority without firing a shot. As analysts have noted, this is how Beijing gradually transforms contested space into controlled space, through persistence, pressure, and the slow erosion of the status quo. The scale of China's maritime surge becomes unmistakable when viewed through the hard data collected by Philippine agencies over the past months. In November 2025, the Philippine Navy logged 19 Chinese warships operating across the West Philippine Sea, one of the highest monthly concentrations recorded in recent years, according to reports from the Philippine News Agency and Manila Times. This represents not just an uptick in numbers, but a dramatic expansion of the types of vessels deployed, from missile destroyers to intelligence ships and even amphibious platforms. Such figures underline a shift from episodic activity to a continuous, multi-domain Chinese presence within Philippine waters. the broader maritime picture is equally striking. The National Coast Watch Center reported that a total of 14,972 vessels were monitored across Philippine maritime zones in November 2025 alone. Of these, 12,450 were foreign vessels, while only 2,522 were domestic, according to data cited by GMA Network.
China Coast Guard Vessel 3303. This is Philippine Coast Guard Vessel BRP Cape San Agustin, MRRB.
This imbalance, foreign ships outnumbering Philippine vessels almost 5-1, sharply illustrates the scale of foreign activity in waters where the Philippines maintains exclusive economic rights. Within this field of foreign presence, Chinese vessels consistently rank among the most active and persistent. These numbers translate into real-world dangers at sea. In August 2025, a Chinese destroyer collided with a China Coast Guard cutter during an aggressive maneuver while both were chasing a Filipino supply vessel en route to Scarborough Shoal, an incident documented by The Guardian and described as one of the most reckless naval encounters in recent years. On 30 November 2025, the Philippine Coast Guard again reported a layered cluster of Chinese vessels near the shoal, including 2 PLA Navy destroyers, 1 replenishment ship, 3 China Coast Guard vessels, and 2 maritime militia boats, as reported by Manila Standard. These deployments reveal a formation built for simultaneous intimidation, surveillance, and tactical denial, a textbook gray zone strategy. What makes the situation even more concerning is how this on-the-water activity aligns with new satellite evidence. Imagery released in early December confirms that the ships detected by the PCG represent only one part of a much larger regional deployment, with additional Chinese flotillas conducting resupply operations beyond the Philippine EEZ. The vessels visible to Philippine patrols are simply the outward face of a deeper, more coordinated network of Chinese naval activity, extending across the Philippine Sea and Western Pacific. In other words, the pressure the Philippines sees is only a fraction of the force China is now capable of projecting. The December 3rd surveillance flight provided one of the clearest snapshots yet of China's layered maritime posture around Bajo de Masinloc.
Itong 21562, this is the China Coast Guard vessel that is being directly challenged by BLP Cabra. And in which nakita nyo naman ang BLP Cabra still patrol.
During the routine patrol, the Philippine Coast Guard identified 3 China Coast Guard vessels, including one positioned at the northern entrance of the shoal, a location often used to restrict access to Filipino fishermen and patrol boats. Alongside them were 3 PLA Navy ships, consisting of 2 missile destroyers and a replenishment ship that Philippine officials noted had been loitering in the area for nearly 2 months. Their long-term presence signals more than intimidation. It reflects sustained operations backed by logistics. Adding to the complexity were 2 maritime militia boats, appearing for the first time in months, and 2 Chinese buoys placed both inside and outside the shoal, reinforcing China's incremental territorial marking strategy. The heightened tensions were not limited to maritime activity. As the PCG aircraft conducted its patrol, it was challenged over radio by PLA Navy Ship 553, which issued warnings in an attempt to push Philippine forces away from their own EEZ. The PCG's response was firm and grounded in international law. The flight crew reiterated the Philippines' sovereign rights under Republic Act 12064, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, and the 2016 Arbitral Award, which invalidated China's expansive maritime claims. This assertive legal response has become a crucial component of PCG operations, ensuring that every encounter documents Manila's lawful position. What is unfolding in the West Philippine Sea is not a series of isolated maritime incidents. It is a repeatable, observable, and increasingly structured pattern of escalation.
China Coast Guard Vessel 4305. This is Philippine Coast Guard Vessel BRP Teresa Magbanwa.
Data from Philstar shows that in November 2025 alone, Philippine authorities detected around 30 Chinese vessels, including warships, Coast Guard cutters, militia boats, and dual-use platforms operating within the country's maritime zones. This level of activity surpasses normal patrol patterns and reflects a deliberate presence that is renewed month after month. At the core of this pattern is China's well-documented gray zone model, a strategy that relies on blending different types of forces to create constant pressure without crossing into open conflict.
I'm performing law enforcement duties on the jurisdictional waters of the People's Republic of China.
The mix typically includes PLA Navy ships for high-end deterrence, China Coast Guard vessels for enforcement and blockade operations, maritime militia boats for swarming and harassment, auxiliary ships for logistics, and even strategically placed buoys to signal territorial marking. This structure allows Beijing to assert control incrementally, while maintaining plausible deniability and complicating any single-state response. Independent verification from international sources reinforces this assessment. BBC satellite imagery, released in early December, showed Chinese naval groups conducting coordinated resupply operations, a capability that extends mission duration and allows flotillas to remain in contested waters for weeks at a time. Additionally, OSINT analysts have tracked ongoing expansion at a Chinese naval base linked to these deployments, providing the logistical backbone that supports China's incursions into the West Philippine Sea and beyond. These developments confirm that what the Philippines sees on radar and patrol flights is only part of a much larger operational architecture.
The implications are serious and far-reaching.
China's sustained